Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. The U.S. will elect a new president in about 60 days. So why aren't the candidates talking about foreign policy? Things are a little out of the ordinary for us this week. Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is at the Republican National Convention rather than here in the studio with me. She'll be fielding your comments and questions from there. Hey, Malika.
Hi, Lisa.
So a lot of cynicism today among our community when it comes to foreign policy and the presidential candidates.
You're right, Lisa. A majority of the tweets we're seeing say it doesn't matter who the president is, U.S. foreign policy will remain the same no matter what. So, of course, for those of you at home, if you'd like to join this conversation, or for those of you who are here in Tampa with the Stream team, join the conversation. Use the hashtag AJStream.
All right, and joining me at the table in studio is Al Jazeera's very own Rosalind Jordan. She covers the U.S. State Department and Defense for our network. And next to Roz is retired Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer. He is the author of Operation Darkheart, which is a personal account of post-9/11 spycraft and special operations work in Afghanistan. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Welcome to the stream, both of you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
There are a lot of ways that you can be in the stream, and one of our favorites is Google+. These people, who are from all over the world, added us to their circles, and now they're joining us on air today. It's just one more way that you can be in the stream.
Hi, I'm Prabhan Jha from the Center for Global Health Research at the University of Toronto, and I'm in the stream.
Since the campaign for the U.S. White House narrowed to incumbent President Barack Obama and Republican challenger Mitt Romney, there's been almost no mention from either of them about foreign policy, even though the U.S. has some 87,000 troops in Afghanistan and is strengthening its military presence in Asia and Africa. Whoever wins will also face diplomatic challenges with Iran, Russia, and in the Arab world. But polling tells us that American voters will base their decision on who they think will do a better job with the ailing economy. To some degree, that explains the lack of foreign policy discussion. But are voters and candidates missing a key connection here? Listen to this veteran of the Iraq War who attended our stream tweet-in at the RNC.
When we interact with, the issue with Syria, military force, interact with things in Iran, the option is military force. Pakistan, military force. It's that same solution seems to keep reemerging, but it's not exactly the best solution. It's not even a solution in some cases. People right now are focused on the economics, and they don't realize how foreign policy is intertwined with economics. We complain about oil prices on a daily basis, but many people don't understand that oil prices are a pure correlation of foreign policy. The connection between foreign policy and domestic economics is never brought up. It's baffling.
So to Ryan's point, look at this chart from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. This shows that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan account for a significant portion of the projected public debt. And in 2011, look at this. The U.S. spent $700 billion on its military, making it the world's largest military spender, beating China nearly 6-1. So since the candidates aren't talking foreign policy, we will. But we'll also look at what it means to those around the world who will feel the impact, but obviously not get a vote. Our guests are here. We've got community from around the globe. We're ready to go in the Hangouts. Let's get started. And Roz, I want to start with you. A lot of people don't feel there are any real differences between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney when it comes to foreign policy. Can you draw out any significant distinctions?
Well, some of the distinctions that we're seeing, Lisa, really come down to not just the candidates in this case, but the people surrounding them. Notably with Mitt Romney, who has been, up until this campaign, a rather traditional type of Republican, very conservative on fiscal matters, very, socially liberal on a lot of other issues. He's surrounded himself by what we here call the neoconservatives, the people who were really behind the war in Iraq back in 2003, people who have been agitating to go into Iran and to try to stop it from developing a nuclear weapons program, people who see and believe in the axis of evil that George W. Bush talked about when he first became president. These are people who have his ear, who are also working with his vice presidential candidate, Paul Ryan, and it really is raising some significant questions about whether or not some of the and we can debate these points, some of the gains that the Obama administration has made in these past 4 years could be reversed, whether there could be damage, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. The U.S. under Barack Obama has really tried to show, no, the United States is not an enemy of Muslim nations. It's not an enemy of Arab peoples, and has really spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to rebuild a lot of relationships that were essentially ruptured because of the Iraq War.
Tony, Roz makes a good point here. I've actually got a list. Here are some of the advisors to Romney, and they are some of the same old names: Michael Chertoff, we've from Waleed Ferris, Dan Senor.
Right.
John Zakim,
exactly.
John Bolton. Yeah,
Should voters be
Bolton's
worried?
not on the list, but I will say this. I don't think you guys are looking close enough at some of the other names, such as John Lehman. There are Reagan White House folks, and there is, I'll be totally honest here, and this is no surprise to your audience, there is a fight going on within the Republican Party for the heart and soul of national security. There is the Reagan folks, and I'll say I'm a Reagan Republican, and you've got the neocons that came out of the Bush White House. I'd like to believe that by the fact that people like John McCain, who have been called for military use of force against Syria as recent as yesterday.
Correct.
They've been held back. That is not the predominant view of everybody in the Republican Party.
In fact, what you saw was the last Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice essentially arguing yesterday before her speech at the convention that if Mitt Romney had been president when the Syrian uprising started and had degenerated into this civil war, that Mitt Romney wouldn't have just tried to go through the UN to get some sort of coalition to deal with the problem. But it begs the question, what do you do? Well, there are three options. You do nothing, you try to work in a diplomatic fashion, or you use military force. The military under Leon Panetta does not want to do this.
Right, I agree. And I agree with the military's perspective on this. As much as I disagree with the military in many things right now, this is one area, and I do believe President Obama selected the right course. There's been reports of, I cannot confirm it, a covert action with the Turkish to actually enhance our understanding of what's going on internally in Syria, and frankly, we're not there. We have to work with our Arab partners, the Arab League, with Jordan, to find a path forward, because I believe we learned a lot of harsh lessons from Libya. Yeah. Libya was not our finest moment. Libya, we still don't have a clear construct of social order going forward. So one of the first things I think we should always adapt is foreign policy. First, do no harm. And I think I'd like to believe that the conservatives I deal with, and the other issue you've brought up regarding what will be the Romney policy going forward. Look, I've been on the Hill in meetings with conservatives and liberals to debate this, and a lot of folks are hoping that the Reagan view of the world, and let's remember, Reagan did commit troops to Lebanon in, I think it was 1982. It was a very harsh lesson, and immediately upon figuring out this is not in our interest to be in the middle of a civil war, he backed out.
How many Marines were lost in 1986?
We lost a lot of Marines, but we didn't double down and stupid. So this is one of the key things we need to look at, is what is the practical way of going forward? And obviously, who's around you will determine that. But I don't think the debate is settled yet.
Well, I want to get to Syria in just a second. Let's get to Malika.
Tony mentions committing troops, and I think speaking of committing troops, I'd like to get to our Google Hangout, but before I do that, I want to bring up something that President Obama did on Wednesday. He did a segment called IMA on Reddit, which is a community forum, online community forum, and I'm pulling this up on my screen here. Not a lot of foreign policy questions came up during this forum, where people get the chance to ask President Obama the questions that they'd like him to answer. But one did come up, and that was the question of, what was the most difficult decision you had to make? And this is how Obama responded. He said, "The decision to surge our forces in Afghanistan. Anytime you send our brave men and women into battle, you know that not everyone will come home safely." Now with that, I'd like to go to Google Plus, where Ahmed Shuja is waiting. And Ahmed is an Afghan blogger and political commentator. Ahmed, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. And I think that President Obama is actually also very much committed in bringing the troops home, and he has actually shortened the withdrawal timeline of American troops twice, which has actually created a lot of issues in Afghanistan in terms of, are the Afghan troops really ready to take on security responsibilities? And they've been taking on security responsibilities regardless. And I think whenever we talk about American troop presence in Afghanistan, what really misses the point is the fact that the Afghan troops themselves they've had 3 to 4 times more casualties, more injuries, and all of those things. They've sustained a lot of injuries as well, and that is something that's really absent from foreign policy when you talk about the contribution of the Afghans themselves to this war. I think that's important. That needs to be underlined as well. And another important part about the foreign policy, especially when it comes to Afghanistan, is that the Afghan troops have had substandard. They've had pretty good training, but then they really, if you think about it, they've only been an army for 10 years. And there's a lot of issues with that, issues of discipline, issues of equipment, issues of medevac, issues of these issues that keep coming up and that actually are going to put them at a strategic disadvantage when you have a Taliban with their warfare of attrition and everything else, and especially within the context of U.S. withdrawal.
Tony, I want you to pick up on that, but also, didn't Obama lobby to actually stay in Afghanistan and the U.S. got kicked out?
No, we've signed a 10-year agreement, which I think a lot of folks on the Hill have concerns about. This agreement has us staying there for another 10 years, providing any number of support issues. That is something that's going to be debated on the Hill, I think, in September. I don't know, but I've heard a lot of folks are upset about that. Regarding the withdrawal, the target date is 2014. The problem is this: we should never have announced we're leaving in 2014 because that emboldens your enemies and worries your allies. And the Pakistanis are very, very worried about this. I was actually in a meeting recently with certain senior members of the Pakistani government here in Washington, and there is a great deal of concern about what this means for Pakistan. Whether you like them or not, they are there and they have nuclear weapons, and frankly, we have to work with them very closely because the Taliban safe havens are in their country. Let me point out here about the Afghan army. One of the things that's been in the news lately is the green on blue violence. There's been an expansion of that for 2 reasons. First, the Afghan army is not ready for prime time. You're talking about individuals, most of which you recruit cannot count to 20 without taking their shoes off. I'm serious. I'm not talking down. It's just the way the society is built. They don't have a great education system, so you're trying to take individuals who have coming out of basically farming, trying to put them into a military. It's not working well. The high desertion rate results in these guys going back to the Taliban, telling the Taliban what's going on, them sending their own, their own guys in, and then they get through the training and they start killing our folks. That's why we've seen this expansion over the last 3 years. By the way, we warned about this. We said if you open the door to making the Afghan army 3 times larger, you're opening the door for 3 times more insurgents to insult themselves and insinuate themselves.
Now, does the idea of actually ordering the troops in country to get closer to their Afghan partners to actually protect themselves, it sounds paradoxical. Can it work?
I don't think so, because everybody right now is constantly looking over their back. I'm in contact with a number of folks over there. And the other great irony here is, of course, the Karzai government. One of our objectives was to secure the population, to enhance the legal standing of the Karzai government. Well, the Karzai government's done nothing to help itself make it legitimate, because half of the people in Afghanistan hate the Karzai government because they see it as a tribe. Tribe-on-tribe violence is now enhancing. It's not been reported on yet. So the other thing we tend to forget is that we won the battle, the initial battle in 2001, 2002 with the Afghan militia forces, the AMF. We were able to do that by using the culture which existed there, not trying to insinuate a Jeffersonian-style democracy into a culture that has no tradition of democracy. So I think fundamentally we have problems with this very concept.
So I think the question, though, comes back to American voters, which is how do you differentiate between where we go from here with Obama or with Romney?
I think the question is, the Obama administration sees, just from a practical standpoint, a lot of fatigue in the United States. People are tired of war. We've been at war since 2001. That's a long time. People also don't have a lot invested in Afghanistan, even though President Obama did say it was the just war because of September 11th, 2001. Well, Osama bin Laden has been dead for more than a year and is sleeping with the fishes. Americans figure, okay, the reason why we went into Afghanistan is over.
Right.
We should just go ahead and bring our troops out. What's interesting, because I recently did some reporting on this, you don't find a lot of people actually agitating to get out of Afghanistan because so few Americans actually have a loved one or a neighbor who is fighting right now in Afghanistan. 1/2 of 1% of the American population is dealing with Afghanistan as a security problem and as a long-term development problem. And unless more people felt that there was something in it for them, you're not going to see people complaining about it. They're worried about jobs. They're worried about their kids getting a good education. They're worried about keeping their homes. The U.S. economy is slowly recovering, and people naturally are much more fixated on that.
Well, Roz, I think you raised an interesting point that you said people are not going to see people complaining about this. And one of the sentiments being raised on Twitter is that this doesn't change anything, Romney or Obama. There's a tweet here from Munir who says, Obama or Romney is like going into a building through the front or the back door. It doesn't change the building, it only changes the approach. With that, I'd like to go straight to Google Hangout because Ahmed has a follow-up that he'd like to say.
Sure. One of our colleagues in the studio said that there's something to the effect of there's really no culture of democracy in Afghanistan. I respectfully beg to take issue with that assertion. I think that the whole idea of a loya jirga, which was actually the beginnings of the current Afghan government, really is a democratic representation of elders coming and speaking on behalf of the people back home. And in the last 2 elections that we've had more turnout than every midterm U.S. election since the 60s, since the election of Kennedy. And I think that speaks a lot to the ability of the Afghan people to actually take part in representative democracy. And this is not just in an American-style democracy. They've done that despite the fact that they've been threatened by the Taliban, by the insurgency. They've had their eyes gouged. They've had their fingers cut off. I think that assertion is perhaps a little bit problematic. It simplifies a lot of the context.
All right.
Real quick.
Yeah. Real quick.
I fundamentally disagree. There is no tradition of a central democracy. The loya jirga, the Afghan people are not ungoverned, they're self-governed at the tribal level. They come together for these big meetings and they have an idea of what they want to do. Fundamentally, the moment we step away from the Karzai government, it's likely to fail. That's what the studies say.
Tony, I want to shift the topic of discussion to Russia. You know, Obama wants to negotiate with Russia. Romney wants to reset the reset button. This is one area where the two of them have taken on clearly different postures.
Right.
Kind of talk about the implications of each.
Well, the implication primarily is, do we cooperate or do we reestablish ourselves kind of in this Cold War posture where we come from a position of strength? I think that's where the fundamental difference is here. The comments between Mr. Obama, President Obama, and Mr. Medvedev was very interesting. So what had to happen, I think, is there's got to be a determination of what's in our best interest to go forward. The Russians have said under Vladimir Putin that they want to insinuate themselves into global politics. That's why they're vehemently sticking with the Syrians right now. They're supporting the Iranians. They're still very much behind that. And most importantly, they've said that they're jealous of our export. We exported like $66 billion worth of arms last year. Well, they want some of that. Right. So they're trying to actually increase their sale of weapons to the third world as well now. So,
well, does either candidate have a plan, though, to convince Russia that it's better to be allied with the U.S. than it is with China?
That's the $64,000 question, because right now, Russia and China seem to be acting in lockstep, especially when it comes to dealing with the crisis in Syria. But, you know, they're doing so out of very different motivations. Russia is looking at Syria as really its last, sort of area of influence in the Middle East. China is really looking more economically. Where can it make business deals? Where can it send its people to work? Where can it hire local people to work? But, it doesn't have the same kind of national security concern that Russia would have. So is it really going to change? I don't know that under Romney it would make any difference. If anything, I would be more concerned about whether or not the amount of tension that we have seen, particularly because of how to deal with Syria, and to a lesser extent how to deal with Iran, might possibly increase under a Romney administration. But again, it goes back to the point you were raising earlier. Is it the Reagan Republicans, the realist crowd that comes in and says, we've got to do what's practical, what's going to get us results, kind of Nixon goes to China moment? Or are we going to see, let's just, take a hard line with everyone, you're either with us or against us?
Well, Roz, speaking of Russia and Syria and that relationship, I want to read a tweet. I'm pulling it up on my screen now. It's from My World. It says, U.S. President's foreign policy, it usually has a negative impact in the Arab world and the Muslim world, but the GOP is more aggressive. Now, that intersection is something that our next Google Hangout participant wants to talk about, and this is Maria. Maria is a Belarusian freelance journalist. Maria, go ahead.
Hi. Well, I'd like to comment on the possible distinctions in the policy between Romney and Obama, because the recent New York Times article says that basically Romney will repeat the same destiny with Russia as Bill Clinton with China, saying some aggressive things before and then having to confront the situation when the American troops need the Russian territory to pass through Afghanistan. So my question is, Do you think there will be any possible new approaches to deal with Russia, maybe less on value level and more on pragmatic level, to get some results for American foreign policy? For instance, to get Russia's agreement to do something on Syria and other important places on the world. Otherwise, the unipolar world, which seems to be in place, will very quickly be not in the favor of the United States anymore.
Tony, both of you, we've only got 2 minutes left in the show, so Roz and then Tony.
I think it really comes down to who's chosen to be the national security advisor, the person in the White House next to the president who's giving him advice, and who's going to be the Secretary of State. It would have to be, at least in the case of Russia, a very strong personality, because Sergei Lavrov is not going anywhere. He's a very, very strong, determined diplomat.
The Russians traditionally, one of the lessons from the Cold War is their position was what's ours is ours and what's yours is negotiable. So once you understand it about the Russians, you then have to take a very hard line and say, here's the line, this far, no further. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to do it. The tough talk, I agree, is going to have to be right up front. But there are more things we can agree upon between the Russians and the United States, I think, than we disagree upon, especially in looking at how you can array things going on. One of the things the Soviets, that's a slip, the Russians have a problem with is fundamentalist Islamists, just like we do. I mean, they have the breakaway territories in their former republics. They have problems. So we should look at how to work together on certain issues which we would both agree upon after the election.
All right, we're going to hold the conversation there, but don't go away. And everybody in Google Plus, stay put, because we're going to continue all of this in our online conversation, which is the post show that happens right at the top of the hour, rather. But first, we want to take a look at this lead that Malika rounded up earlier at the Republican convention.
We met guerrilla live streamers outside the Republican National Convention earlier this week. Now we've moved inside to Google, the official live stream provider of the event. We're standing now inside the Google Media Center, which is complete with free Wi-Fi, a Google Plus Hangout booth, and broadcast space for their media partners, including Al Jazeera English, to stream live to YouTube. Google's presence marks a stark difference in the prevalence of social media between the campaigns of 2008 and this year. Google's Samantha Smith explains.
Well, so much has changed since 2008. Twitter's exploded, the explosion in mobile devices. Everyone has a smartphone in their pocket. Where in 2008, it wasn't as common. So just the space has grown so much. We're seeing startups popping up everywhere, from Instagram to Pinterest. It's just a really plugged-in culture. So having this ability to access this information for your laptop is no longer a cool new thing. It's a necessity to reach a key voting audience.
That Twitter explosion is something that's reflected here in Tampa with Twitter's own presence at the convention, and something that they call the Twitter Political Index, which tracks positive and negative online comments about the presidential candidates. Twitter's Mark Lucky shows how.
So we see that at the beginning, this is the Supreme Court announcement. In this area right here, this is when Barack Obama made his announcement about gay marriage and his support of that. So you see that there's a trend line that goes all the way through this current day, this being area being the Olympics, and that the graph is shifting. There's peaks and there's valleys, but both candidates are neck to neck at this point.
We'll be tracking that political index, so tell us what you think. Tweet us using the hashtag AJStream. Back to you, Lisa.
All right, thanks, Malika. And Al Jazeera is partnering with YouTube for the U.S. elections, so you can find all of our special coverage on youtube.com/politics. Just click the Al Jazeera tab. And stay with us, though, because the post show is next on our site at stream.aljazeera.com. Couple things we want to get into. We want to talk about Latin America. We want to talk about the drug war. Has either candidate, Obama or Romney, floated any reasonable solutions? And then we want to get back to that idea of whether or not Americans are missing the link between the economy and the military spending, $700 billion in 2011. So those are some of the topics we're going to hit in the online post show, so join us then. And on Monday, we are going to look at the growing sensation that is K-pop, or Korean pop music. And it's going to be on the heels of this unbelievably crazy viral music video, you've probably seen it, that has people worldwide asking, what exactly is Gangnam Style? I asked the same question. Until then, we'll see you online. Welcome back to the Stream's online post show. We're talking about the upcoming U.S. presidential election, why the candidates aren't really spending too much time talking foreign policy. So we are. I'm in the studio with Rosalind Jordan, our chief U.S. State Department correspondent and defense correspondent, and Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. Thank you guys for sticking around for our post show. Let's get to the war on drugs. And President Obama had an opportunity to talk about this.
He
yesterday.
did. He was on Reddit, and a lot of people, once they found out the president was on Reddit saying, ask me anything, they started asking about the drug policies of the United States, about the attempts to try to deal with narcotics traffickers in Mexico and in Central America.
And they quickly found out, ask me everything doesn't mean I'll answer anything.
Not one answer. And that's really, really serious because, just last week, just south of Mexico City, 2 U.S. employees at the embassy in Mexico City were ambushed and they were shot and they had to be flown back to the U.S. for medical treatment. Now, of course, the question is, well, who are they and what exactly were they up to? But they were with a military escort from the Mexican army. And so you really have to wonder, is the U.S. actually doing anything to try to stop illegal drugs from coming north into the United States? And if it is doing something on a very, widespread basis, why isn't the Obama administration talking about it? There's a lot of frustration out there in this country that he is not talking more forcefully about illegal narcotics, about whether legalization is the appropriate strategy, and whether doing so would actually improve security, not just in the United States, but in Mexico, which has been in the middle of a 6-year-long fight against drug traffickers, and in Central America as well.
Tony, you want to weigh in on this?
Absolutely. It's ironic that my next book, The Last Line, is actually going to be about this very issue, the Southwest border. It's called The Last Line because I think this is the last line of defense because we have a lot of issues, not only drug, but there's a lot of issues with the Southwest border in general. Fast and Furious is only the tip of the iceberg regarding the fact that you have violence, beheading of people trying to make their way to this country being intercepted and killed by the cartels.
Well, not just beheadings, but mass killings.
Right.
They're just dumping them, in the street where anyone can just see them, and it sends a message of fear.
Right, and it's spilling over into our border now, and we're not really we don't have a clear policy on what to do next. That's one of the reasons we're doing a book on this area. With that said, the whole drug policy needs to be relooked. I used to work counter drug in the mid-'90s, and a quick story. I sat on the watch at Jada Feast, which is Key West, great place to be, by the way, and I watched a drug pilot fly out of Colombia, fly past Panama, an F-16 came up on his tail, followed him all the way in to Mexico. Then our customs guys pick him up with their citation, follow him, he lands, and he offloads his drugs, goes back in the air and flies back to Colombia. I said, well, what are we going to do? Oh, well, that's all we do, we just monitor. What? We just spent literally $180,000 to monitor a guy being successful in dropping off drugs. So what is that netting us?
And is that what you should be using an F-16 for?
Exactly. And I thought it was a misuse of the weapon system then, and it is now. And now, to what effect? What did we spend all this money? We spent $6 billion over the past 10 years in Afghanistan doing quote-unquote counter-drug. More poppies are getting out than ever.
But it's not working.
It's not working.
What candidate has posed a solution to this? Has either? I mean, we know Obama didn't talk about it yesterday.
No, and Romney hasn't talked about it. And, is it because it's not polling? Is it because it's assumed because of his religious faith that he wouldn't be in support of any kind of, drug use anyway? But, there is the use of medical marijuana in the state of Massachusetts, which is where he was governor in the last part of the last decade. So, but if he touches it, it creates a big fight among those people who want to see legalization versus those, particularly in law enforcement, who say, no, we can't have anarchy on this issue because it will be an anarchistic situation.
While we're talking about Latin America, let's go to our Google Plus Hangout where we can speak to someone from the region, Argentina to be specific. Mateus, go ahead.
Hi. We see this is a broader issue in Latin America that we are experiencing probably the moment with the highest degree of autonomy of Latin American countries regarding foreign policy from the U.S., probably only parallel to the following years of after the Second World War. Countries from Latin America are dealing with the issues by themselves and many times even against the U.S. So, but there are things that we still need to cooperate. And one of the things is drug trafficking, because we have the first market of consumption, the first market of exporting. So we think many of our presidents and leaders are changing their approach from the military approach that the U.S. have on the issue, from more an approach based on human rights, based on security. There are many changes, and in this subject, Latin America is moving ahead. Even Uruguay is probably becoming the first country in the world legalizing fully the marijuana. So there's a thing that the U.S. must sit down on the table and discuss with the countries, with the rest of the countries. I like to know what you think. What is the experts in both teams are discussing.
Tony?
Well, I think the idea of military cooperation in Latin America with our allies is always a good idea. I think it helps everybody learn and trust each other better. But I don't think military is necessarily the way to go for the solution. I think we need to look at the social issues relating to use. I mean, obviously, if you don't have a demand for an illicit product, you would not be able to make money. And obviously,
Right.
if you take the profitability out of it and reduce that, that's obviously the way to go. So I think we've overly relied upon a military solution for a lot of things. I mean, if you're a carpenter, everything looks like you can use a hammer on it. And I think
Right.
that's part of the deal here. Is I think we've spent a lot of money this way. So I think we need to look at. And I was on MSNBC a while back with I think the former ambassador from Colombia talking about the fact that we need to look at a wider spectrum of options beyond military, beyond simple military cooperation. So.
And just look at how much demand there is here in the United
Right,
States.
absolutely.
It's never discussed. Andrew Sullivan, the pundit and scholar, has been running this ongoing discussion on his blog
Right.
about whether or not marijuana should be decriminalized. And he's collected stories from people all over the United States describing how I'm educated, I'm a professional person, I'm a parent, I'm upstanding, I go to church, and yes, I have a couple of joints on the weekend, no harm, no foul. It's, there is this gap. There has been no one to fill this gap on whether or not using is actually going to lead to addiction, which is always,
Right.
What they say the worst case is, which is why we have to use every tool
Right.
available
I think
to keep
alcohol-
the drugs from coming right in.
I think alcohol is as much of a gateway drug as marijuana is. I mean, let's be blunt here, and that's legal.
But
so.
neither side is going to talk
Right.
about it, until they feel that they're past that crisis moment, which is November 6th, Election Day.
Right.
All right, want to get back to Malika?
Well, I'd like to shift gears here a bit, Lisa, and speak about Africa. There's a tweet that just came in from Iniola. She says, U.S. foreign policy for Africa has always been the same, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. And of course, that's a sentiment that we've seen a little bit earlier in the show. But I'd like to go to Google+, and I'd like to speak to a resident of Africa. I'd like to speak to Tony, who's speaking to us from Uganda. And Tony is an international lawyer based in Kampala. Go ahead, Tony.
Hi. Well, it's been kind of interesting to see the EU foreign policy over the last, say, 8 years. But a lot of people have actually said that they were expecting to see so much from the Obama administration in regard to Africa. I mean, looking at his roots, his Kenyan roots, and so on and so forth. But so many people actually see that the Bush administration actually did more as compared to the current Obama administration in regard to Africa. It's quite interesting that when Hillary Clinton came down recently, she kind of talked of a new Africa policy, which of course had 4 main issues, which were, improving on democracy, the eye of economic growth, security, and trade. But,
Tony, I'm going to need you to get to your question.
Yeah, my main questions are in regard to democracy. I mean, why does the U.S. come at such a time, and yet we see them many a times relating with what we would call undemocratic governments in Africa? In regard to AFRICOM, we're wondering what is the role of AFRICOM in Africa? What's the mandate of Africa? We now know that.
All right, Roz, we've got about 30 seconds left. You want to grab that?
Basically, what's AFRICOM doing? It's providing very, very quiet military training for people in the region known as the Sahel, reaching from the Horn of Africa to sort of like the armpit of West Africa, trying to make people more capable of fighting Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, other extremist groups.
Anti-terrorism.
All right.
Yeah.
Tony Schaefer, Roz Jordan, thanks so much for being with us
welcome.
today. Goodbye to Malika in Tampa at the RNC, and thanks to all of our online community for joining in today's show. We'll see you online.